With that, I am going to bring us into our first panel. Our first panel, as I indicated, will focus on the potential role of compliance markets, and we'll look at a number of different nodes in which compliance markets could play a role. And so, with that, I am going to turn over the dais to Simon Nicholson, who is the co-executive director of the Institute, to introduce our speakers and to lead us into that panel. Simon?
Thank you, Will. Let me add my welcome. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure to be host and moderator for this first panel, which we have titled Incorporating Carbon Dioxide Removal into Compliance Markets, ? I'm joined by three guests, so I'll invite to turn on cameras now. Our first guest is Danny Cullenwood, Senior Fellow at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and also Senior Fellow with us at the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. Welcome, Danny. Ingrid Udsundvor is co-founder and director of Carbon Balance Initiative and also a research associate at Oxford Net Zero at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Ingrid. And Darius Soltani, doctoral researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Hi, Darius. Let's get straight to our panelists. I've invited each of them just to introduce themselves a little bit, in a couple of minutes, a bit more about themselves and their work, and also to bring into the room a couple of key questions or themes that they'd like to have us start to consider at the start of the day today. Let's start with you, Danny, and also the other prompt was, what is a compliance market? Can you unpack this language a bit for us?
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Danny Cullenwood. I'm a climate economist and a lawyer, and I've been working on carbon accounting, carbon markets, and climate policy for the better part of over 15 years now. I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is I think there's an opportunity with carbon removal to do things right and to contribute to the overall climate mitigation strategy of stabilizing planetary temperatures. I think one of the great challenges with the situation is how we design accounting and compliance structures that accurately capture what's going on, accurately credit the outcomes that matter and can be measured and monitored carefully. Who's going to do that work? And how is that work going to be done in a way that raises the bar above the many problems that are now well documented in conventional carbon offsetting markets, whether they're run by governments or in the voluntary sector? And I've been reflecting a lot on this question, in part, Simon, with respect to your question around what a compliance market is. And I think it's actually really hard to define a compliance market carefully. The best definition I can come up with is you're dealing with a regulatory program, some sort of government program that requires some sort of climate outcome. And one of the things it does is it can accept carbon credits as a means of compliance. And the reason that's kind of an abstract definition is because when you look at the history of carbon offsets and carbon crediting programs around the world, there's so much overlap between voluntary and compliance markets. It's really hard to disentangle them. And that gets to this core question of who writes the rules and how are they managed and can they be managed well? You see privately written rules being uptaken into government-run programs where they become compliance credits because they're accepted for compliance purposes, but they were written and developed in the private sector. You see publicly developed market standards being diffused through voluntary markets and used in the voluntary sector. So there's enormous overlap between the two. And the compliance focus that I think about is when a carbon credit or a methodology for crediting an outcome is deemed a valid way to comply with a government program. And that's the nexus I focus on with respect to your question. Back over to you, Simon.
Helpful, Danny. Thank you. Darius, to you, just a few words of introduction about yourself and your work, and then a theme or two. And anything else you'd like to add to this definitional question about what a compliance market is?
Thank you very much. Great to be here. Thanks for having me as well. So yeah, as you rightly said, Simon, I'm a doctoral researcher here at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. My background is actually in engineering, and yeah, I've come into the field through experience with the European Commission, also the German government. And I'm entering the field of CDR and this question of integrated into compliance markets, very much from the compliance market side of things. So my research evolves a lot around questions around the European emissions trading system. I focus on the decarbonization of the basic materials industry here. So I have done a lot of research on the steel industry, the cement industry, and yeah, more recently, we have looked at the question what it would mean to integrate removals into the European compliance market from a more quantitative but also more conceptual point of view. I'm not sure I have a lot to add to Danny's definition, to be honest. I mean, for us, in a very pragmatic modeling way, we kind of distinguish the compliance market. And actually, for a European context, it does make a lot of a difference which kind of compliance markets you look at, because we don't have the ETS1, which covers the power sector and the heavy industry anymore only, but starting next year, basically we have the introduction of the ETS2 as well, which is going to cover transport and heating buildings as well. And obviously, if you consider these kind of questions, you always have to provide a bit more detail which compliance markets, at least for the European contract, which compliance market you're talking about. And I think this is also relevant for the international context. Obviously, there are many compliance markets we can think of when we talk about integrated removals, and we'll get into that throughout the panel, I'm pretty sure. But I would leave it at that, and then looking forward to the discussions we're going to have.
Thank you, Darius. Yes, I do anticipate we'll hear more about the how and why of different compliance markets during your presentation. To you, Ingrid.
Yeah, hello everyone. So quickly, I'm a co-founder and director of a new NGO called Carbon Balance Initiative, which is an NGO we founded out of University of Oxford around two and a half years ago. And I think that's an important context to come with. So I'm not presenting a paper here today. I'm presenting various concepts that we're working on, among other things, geological net zero and carbon storage mandates as a sort of future mechanism for compliance. So I think that's the first premise. The second premise I wanted to highlight as well is I do have my experiences mostly UK and European policy space, which I think is important to every jurisdiction has its own context. And although some learnings apply, I think that's important to understand the concepts I come from and the learnings we have taken is very much embedded in the jurisdictions I focus on. But on topics for today and some thoughts that I would like to prompt everyone to think about is one we focus a lot on, and what keeps me up at night is how a lot of the work we do with policymakers, we realize the sort of short-term bias of policy design choices that it's created. We live within a political space with short time windows of decisions. And I think this is something that I keep reiterating when I have panels like this, is we need to keep ensuring that the long-term goal is in mind and that we work backwards from that. The second thing I work a lot on, both with Oxford and in Carbon Balance, is who should pay for this massive scaling of CDR. And I'm pretty sure the panelists with me will dig into that in the second part of this talk. Yeah.
So the format for the rest of our session together, we're going to have 15-minute presentations from each of our panelists, starting with Danny and then Darius and then Ingrid. Danny suggested that I interrupt along the way if folks have clarifying questions or would like to pause and interrogate him a little bit. So everybody who's listening, please use the Q&A function vigorously throughout the presentations. We'll also pause after each presentation just to see if there's any conversation that's generated amongst the panelists. And then we have plenty of time at the end of all of this for additional conversation and for the responses to questions from the audience. So Danny, kick us off.
All right, thank you, Simon. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what's going on in the Article 6 negotiations, and specifically the part of the Article 6 process that deals with carbon markets, which is called Article 6.4, and is also called the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism is the official non-numerical name. Before I get started, I want to make a couple of disclosures. So I want to make sure that everyone understands I'm speaking today in my personal capacity as a researcher. I have a separate appointment on what's called the Methodological Expert Panel for the Article 6.4 mechanism, and I want to be very clear, I'm not representing that body here today. I've also previously consulted for a carbon dioxide removal registry and have a full list of disclosures. I think these are the ones that are relevant to the conversation today, just to make sure that we're all above board and that everyone understands I'm just speaking for myself. So to start, maybe where Simon prompted the beginning of the conversation is, what is a compliance market? And the work I've been thinking about in relation to the Paris Agreement has really helped me clarify for myself that it's almost impossible to disentangle compliance and voluntary markets, because when you get into the mechanical definitions of what's going on, we talk about compliance markets as a compliance application of a carbon credit. When somebody says, I'm going to use this carbon credit to comply with a legally binding climate policy. And I think, again, that's the best definition I can come up with, is the nexus is for compliance purposes. And what makes this so complicated is you have government written protocols that enter the voluntary markets, and you have private written protocols and methodologies entering the compliance markets. So there's enormous overlap between the two in terms of where the rules come from, whose rules are being used. And the focus I use when I think about compliance markets is what is allowed to be used for compliance purposes in a legally binding program. And both of these turn out to be very relevant because the United Nations carbon crediting mechanisms have played significant roles both in compliance uses, first under the Kyoto Protocol, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and the large carbon offsetting program called the Clean Development Mechanism that was developed by the UNFCCC. That was a compliance market. But a lot of those projects and credits have actually circulated widely in the voluntary market since this time. A lot of the methodologies you see in use in the voluntary markets either directly use these government-written methodologies or are derived from them or are substantially related to them. So there's quite a bit of overlap when you dig in. And as I share more of the story about where the Article 6 process is today and where it might be going, I encourage people to think about the sort of two-way street between compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets. There's a lot of cross-pollination for good and for bad. So within the scope of Article 6, there's sort of three areas of Article 6 of the 2015 Paris Agreement that think about voluntary cooperation. Article 6.2 primarily concerns cooperation between governments, resulting in what are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. There's Article 6.8, which focuses on non-market ways of cooperation. And Article 6.4, which is the subject of what I'll be speaking about today, is the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. It's the carbon market that's being designed essentially as the replacement for the clean development mechanism in the context of the Paris Agreement. And when you think about the overall structure of the Article 6 market, I think it's important to think about the governance structure of the process. At the very top level, we have the annual meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. We call this the CMA. This is one of the subgroups that meets at the annual COPs, including the one that's going on right now as we speak in Baku in Azerbaijan. The parties to the Paris Agreement, the CMA, oversee the entire process and are the ultimate legal body that's responsible for designing and approving the rules. But a lot of the functions to actually develop the mechanics of these kinds of programs are delegated below the level of the international meetings that happen every year. And the name of the body that is principally in charge of these rules and methodologies is called the Article 6.4 Mechanism Supervisory Body. This is the intermediate body that does most of the decision-making in this process. And it has currently two technical panels. One is called the Methodological Expert Panel, on which I serve, and there's another accreditation expert panel that focuses on how to accredit the various parties and the processes that are involved. The Methodological Expert Panel is charged with providing technical expertise and input to help draft and design the documents that implement the rules and decisions that are made at the higher levels of the governance process, including both those dictated directly by the CMA as well as those developed by the supervisory body. So I want to give a quick timeline of what's been going on in this process to kick off our discussion as we think about the future of where this process might end up. The history of the Article 6 negotiation stretches back to, easily to the 2015 Paris Agreement and arguably much earlier than that. In the 2015 Paris Agreement, Article 6 was part of that process, and it outlined these different ways of using potentially market-based instruments to comply with rules. There were a number of decisions that came from the annual conferences that provided additional direction to the supervisory body in the evolution of this process, including direction at COP26 in Glasgow and additional direction at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The supervisory body ended up developing a set of recommendations for how to operationalize the market, including some specific recommendations related to what are called removals, which is the term that's used in the Article 6 process for what in the industry is called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. You hear removals just as the shorthand phrase it's the word that's used. These were documents that were approved by the supervisory body as recommendations to the CMA level discussions at the annual COP. And no decision or other action was taken in 2023 in Dubai in response to these earlier documents from the supervisory body. So in a sense, there was uncertainty about exactly what the direction of the program was going to be, because although the supervisory body had made a set of recommendations, the CMA did not uptake those recommendations or officially recognize them in any way. At the beginning of this year, the methodological expert panel was appointed, and it began work under the terms of those earlier documents that were proposed as recommendations to the CMA, but not formally approved or rejected. And there have been a couple of important developments in the last couple of weeks, actually. In October of this year, the supervisory body finalized 2 standards that closely relate to the content of the earlier recommendations that were made in 2023. And they formalized both a set of requirements for how carbon crediting methodologies should operate in the Article 6.4 program, as well as some specific guidance related to activities involving removals. There is earlier last week, at the current COP in Baku, there was a decision taken to acknowledge and accept these documents as operational. And there is additional guidance that's being negotiated as we speak. So I can't comment on what that is other than to say that there are public documents that might provide additional guidance from the CMA level discussions to the supervisory body for its work ahead. So the big change in the Article 6 process is last year there were sort of no formal developments in recognition of the direction of the Article 6 discussion. And now there's a little bit more of a concrete sense of direction and some specific standards and documents that describe the current status of the program and priorities for moving forward. And I think the key thing for people to be aware of in this program is this is a bottom-up market design. So the overall program process is designed to produce standards, which are higher level governance documents that indicate the requirements for methodology developers. The program could also include a set of standardized tools that are referenced by standards and methodologies. So a standard could say, please use a tool when developing a methodology for a given sector. But it's ultimately these methodologies that are the documents that are used and the rule sets that are used to determine who can earn credits. And this relationship is very important. I'm giving you an example here. A renewable energy methodology must be developed according to mechanism-wide standards for additionality and baselines. The methodology can require projects to use certain tools or to establish additionality in certain ways. This is the basic structure of the process. And what's critical to understand here is, though there might be program-wide standardization of standards and tools, a lot of the methodologies in the past have been proposed as bottom-up processes where individual methods come forward. Somebody says, I think I have a way of following your standards and using your tools. And somebody outside of the process might propose into the process the adoption of a particular methodology. There's another, I think, very important connection between the Article 6.4 mechanism and the older Clean Development Mechanism, which is the first major UN carbon crediting program. Not only do these two programs have essentially identical governance structures and in many cases overlapping individuals involved in them, but there is a huge supply of older credits from the Clean Development Mechanism that are eligible for countries to comply with the first round of their nationally determined commitments under the Paris Agreement. There's also a very large set of projects that are eligible for what's called transition to the Article 6.4 process. So there's something on the order of 93 million credits from the old system that countries can use if they want for compliance purposes under the Paris Agreement for their first round of Paris Agreement pledges. There's also a large volume of projects, over 900 million credits are estimated to be available from these legacy methodologies or these legacy projects, which are authorized to use their legacy methodologies from the Clean Development Mechanism through the end of next year. Beginning in 2026, credit issuance is supposed to be limited to methodologies that are developed under the Article 6 process. And even if a project has transferred into this new program from the older program, it will have to use the new rules. None of those rules currently exist, and I'll give you a quick preview of what is in store for the year ahead. From the supervisory body's documents, we know that there are a set of priorities for methodology development, including standards for baselines, suppressed demand, additionality, and leakage. So these are some of the foundational meta tools in the program. There are various concepts that need to be articulated further for various issues related to operationalizing the market. When it comes to removals, there is a standard that's called an integrated standard for non-permanence and removals that is going to address a number of issues related to monitoring carbon storage and thinking about reversal risks and reversal risk compensation. There's also a concept note on how to think about the connections between these non-permanence management issues between removals and emissions reductions, as well as the relationship between the methodological rules for emissions reductions and carbon removal. The third category of priority areas, and I'll wrap up here and turn it over to my colleagues for discussion. There are a number of methodologies from the clean development mechanism from the older carbon crediting world that are planned for revisions, including a substantial focus on renewable energy carbon crediting and a variety of other emission reduction policies that are in line. So part of the reason I wanted to give this background and introduction to the Article 6 process and the complexity both of where it's been in the last couple of years as well as where it's going is because if this is going to be a mechanism that facilitates or at least allows for carbon removal to be integrated into the Paris Agreement through a tradable credit-based system, there are a number of things that need to be accomplished in the years ahead. One of the first things is the major program standards need to be finalized and approved. Many of these are based on the legacy Clean Development Mechanism program, even if there are substantial differences in the guidance documents approved by the supervisory body in any direction given from the CMA level discussions at the annual COPs. These are standards that have already been in use in the predecessor program, and so there's familiar text and blueprints for revising and iterating those documents. There also need to be the development of removal-specific standards, particularly for managing non-permanence and reversal risks. These don't exist in the predecessor program, and so they need to be created essentially from scratch. There also need to be new methodologies, and for a variety of reasons I don't have time to get into, there basically wasn't much in the way of removal-related activities or even land sector-related activities in the Clean Development Mechanism program. So when you think about the future of carbon removal under Article 6, some of the core market features that need to be developed first are sort of in motion and are agnostic as to whether we're talking about removals or emission reduction projects. But when it comes to the carbon removal specific methodologies, there's quite a bit of work to be done that involves essentially creating these methodologies and standards from scratch. And to me, that raises a number of the sort of standard questions when you think about the political economy of market design. There's an enormous focus on the precedent of the Clean Development Mechanism program. There's quite a bit of architecture for the non-removals parts of that program, but there isn't a lot when it comes to removals, which is both an opportunity and a challenge. An opportunity in the sense if you're concerned about the quality of what's been done before, it's possible to start from scratch and do it better. The flip side is that you have to basically do all of the work from scratch. And in an environment where there are relatively few people who are focused on removal specifically, you can imagine that there's enormous complexity and challenges in trying to operationalize standards that are open to the variety of CDR removal pathways that we talk about in policy and industry circles, where essentially there are no sort of standard blueprints for how to think about removals management in a way that's agnostic to enhanced weathering or potentially marine applications or geologic storage subsurface. There's so many different ways you can think about carbon removal and so little in the way of precedent from which to build from the existing programs. So I'll stop there. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Danny. The final slide kind of preceded or anticipated the question that was emerging as you were talking about the layering of the Article 6.4 mechanism on that earlier clean development mechanism. And so I guess I'm wondering just what appetite there is to look back at the clean development mechanism and work out what went well and what can we learn from, or are we just going to layer on top of something that has some flaws?
This is something that, I am a bit of a squeaky wheel about. So I've I've spent a lot of time studying the clean development mechanism. It was actually sort of how I got introduced to climate policy, was studying that as an undergrad. And there's a lot that didn't work very well from my perspective. And I think the academic literature is pretty clear that it didn't go great. There's a variety of opinions about what worked and what didn't, as there is in any complicated subject. But I think it's fair to say the balance of evidence, says it's not a pretty picture. And I think one of the challenges is that it's the exact same governance model that's in place right now for the development of the standards. So I think the best answer I can give you is it's basically the same system, but it's a blank slate. And so, I'll be working to make sure that there's public awareness of opportunities to engage the documents as they're developed. But you could easily imagine reinventing the wheel. You could also imagine efforts to try and substantially raise the bar. And I think it will be up to people to judge which of those directions the process ultimately takes.
Yeah, before I check for any questions or follow-on thoughts from Darius and Ingrid, a question from the audience here, Danny. Can you say more about reversal risk and reversal compensation in the documentation or conversations to date around 6.4?
So I think this is an area where there's been a lot of conversation. Very little of it has yet emerged into the public sphere. And so I'm limited to what I can say as to what's been in the public space. This is a topic I've been personally very engaged on, both in the methodological expert panel and in my own personal academic work. And I think it's important to know that the supervisory body documents that were finalized in October actually lay out with quite a bit of specificity what's anticipated. There are a number of issues, specifically the duration of management for how long you have to monitor for reversal risks and how long you sort of want to look into the future when you think about reversal risk management, that I don't think are explicitly stated in the document. But there's quite a bit of specificity, and I will drop into chat the link for that document, which I've just dropped into chat. And I think the best answer I can give you is take a look at that, and that will be the blueprint for all of the conversation that follows.
Appreciate it. And Darius, Ingrid, anything you'd like to throw in, or we can move to your presentation, Darius?
Maybe Ingrid, if you want to go first, then please feel free to.
I guess I have a more overarching conceptual question, which speaks a little bit to the political environment, to the international environment we're currently in, Danny. So you mentioned that the complexity and the challenge is enormous to specify the methodologies for carbon removals. And sort of, are you hopeful, I guess, or is this a challenge that will be difficult to overcome, as the current consensus culture is quite weak in a sense?
It's a great question. I'll give you the optimistic answer and then the pessimistic answer. I think the optimistic answer is if people figure out how to do it well, I don't anticipate that there would be barriers to importing a sound solution into a process like this. But I think the challenge is, tasking a consensus-oriented body in a multilateral process deep in the weeds of 7 layers of UN bureaucracy to create something incredibly complicated from scratch with very few resources available or even much in the way of compensation for time spent is a huge lift. And I think to me, the fundamental critiques I would have of the performance of the voluntary carbon market is we just sort of said, let everybody go write whatever they think their standards should be, and the market will sort it out. And I would suggest that the market has not sorted it out very well, and we just get stuck in low gear. And that, in many respects, appears to be the default position if you don't adequately staff and prioritize the development of careful methodological development, and you have a bottom-up process. It sounds a lot like looking for somebody to bring the solution to the table. And again, the optimist in me says, if somebody figures out a good way to do that, they can probably bring that to the table. But somebody could also figure out a kind of a low quality way to do it and bring it to the table and say, well, there's nothing else that's available, so go with what I've got. And I hope that won't be the direction this takes, but you could imagine that as a failure mode if there isn't sufficient consensus to do something better.
Just to follow up on the challenges you already mentioned with the CDM, Danny, you rightly pointed out the academic literature is quite vocal about those challenges as well. And yeah, we all know the the problems with additionality, but also the market being swamped with cheap certificates. So I would be interested to know, do you see any removal methods that would be more or less prone or more at risk to repeating these challenges? So I could play devil's advocate and be like, okay, with DAX, we don't really have this problem. We really know how much CO2 we capture. We pump it in the ground. It's going to be there for millennia. So we don't have an additionality problem. So just going a bit into this direction, could you elaborate on that a bit?
So I come at this, and again, the optimist in me says there are things about carbon removal big picture that I give me a sense of hope that we could tackle some of those challenges well. But Director captures a great example where it's a very energy intensive process. And how do you account for the induced emissions associated with adding new load to the grid if you have a grid connected DAC facility? It's very easy to do that well. It's very easy to do that poorly. I think that's just an example of one of the methodological challenges. You either account for those emissions properly, which will take work and be expensive, or you look the other way, and it starts to me to look a lot like a poorly designed, conventional renewable energy crediting methodology or forestry methodology. I think a lot of the pathways involving biomass and counterfactual uses of biomass materials, or that rely on assumptions that biogenic emissions don't need to be counted, are equally problematic and challenging. And the last thing I'll say about this is that many of the people involved in this process have expertise. Everyone involved in this process has expertise in carbon markets, but some of them don't have very much experience in removals. And so in a removals conversation, we can say, oh, here's what I think about rock weathering and DAC and marine. And we all have kind of a fluidity around our ability to discuss this. There's much less cross-literacy in the conventional market spaces. So I just flag that as a potential additional issue. And that's a challenge for the broader carbon removal community because I would respectfully suggest you want a non-permanent standard thinking about reversal risk and reversal risk management that doesn't myopically prioritize one pathway over another for arbitrary reasons. I would suggest you would want a standard that is relatively agnostic to the pathway and technology that is workable across different mechanisms and methodologies. And I think that's hard to develop from scratch, and it's particularly hard to develop in an environment where there's more focus on emission reductions instruments than there is on carbon removal.
Thanks, Danny. Let's turn to Darius's presentation now and just flagging Danny's other questions coming in for you in the Q&A, which you can respond to in writing or hold on to until after the presentations. Darius.
Perfect. And let me share my screen. There we go. So yeah, I would like to take these 15 minutes to present some quantitative work that I've done with a couple of colleagues here at the Institute and also with some colleagues at the ETH in Zurich. And we basically looked at the question, which kind of effects could we anticipate by integrating CDR into the European emissions trading system. And I already said earlier, it doesn't really have a meaning if you just say ETS in the European context. So we specifically look at the ETS1 integrating CDR into the ETS for the power sector and removals. I don't think there's a lot of need to motivate our research in this kind of for this kind of audience, but yeah, as you're all aware, the IPCC has mapped out these 3 high-level phases for CDR. So we complement abatement today. We have the residual emissions we want to take care of tomorrow, and then in the long run, there's the overshoot that we need to take care of. Sounds nice, but there hasn't really been a substantiation of a policy path for this kind of vision. So we sat down and we kind of applied 2 policy principles. One is the one of policy sequencing, and the other one is the one that England already mentioned kindly, the one of policy backward induction. So we want to have a target picture first, and then starting with the policies we have in place today, we think about how can we develop a framework or a sequencing path that leads up to this long-term target picture. And to address this gap, we basically did exactly that. So we first map out a first best vision for removal policy, a long-term economic framework or economically desirable framework that is obviously debatable. We just put it out there to have a North Star to develop towards to. Then we take this first best integration of BECS and DAX and model what it would do to the certificate market under the EU ETS 1. And we derive a couple of risks from such an approach and use these risks to then design a sequencing path that shields the architecture against these risks, and making sure that an integration can occur, but without attacking the integrity of the system that we have in place today. Let me maybe say one more sentence for the European context. So, as many of you know, the EU ETS is the leading policy instrument and the leading climate policy instrument we have in place today in the EU. And from our perspective, it just makes a lot of sense to leverage what we already have and use this instrument to tackle the challenges that we see both on the carbon market itself, but also for the ramp-up of removals that we have ahead. But happy to discuss this going forward. I think I'll go very quickly over the related literature. So there's a bit of research out there on the theoretical efficiency, optimal pricing for removals, also removal certificates. And I think most of the work has been done on techno-economic and socio-economic assessments for CDR, which is especially interesting for our modeling. So we kind of see a lot of cost projections for novel CDR methods being done in the past couple of years, and kind of leverage these data to come up with the best reasonable estimate that we could come up with. And then the third category that has been covered relatively extensively is the governance part from a European perspective, and especially docking points in the EU climate policy architecture, but not as detailed as we have mapped it out in our work. So let me start with the first best vision. And as I've already said, so there's a lot of points that we can argue about, and it's obviously not a world that will materialize even in the very long run, but we thought it might make sense to think about, okay, from a purely economic perspective, which is the long-term framework that we need to think about. And we identified three main categories that are relevant for this. So first of all, we need a system that allows for Pigouvian efficiency. What do I mean by that? So obviously, if you want to let the market forces decide whether it's efficient to have abatement versus removal, then you need to allow in the system that the marginal abatement cost can equal the marginal permanent removal cost. And yes, if you think this through, then you'll end up in the very long run at a position in which, at least for permanent removals, you have some sort of fungibility between certificates. As a government, you can step in and have some exchange rates or any restricting measures between the two. But if you want the full efficiency picture, you need to allow for the two to meet at some point. The problem we have with that, though, is we don't have comprehensive Pigouvian pricing in our system these days. And I think, Danny, the example you brought with the biomass is a prime example for that already. So just picture if I allow BECS in the compliance market today, but I don't cover the externalities that are implied from the increased demand for biomass, then obviously I have distortions, and I create a system in which there's excessive demand for biomass with all its biodiversity and the food system pressures, all these challenges that come with it. So obviously, this long-term picture can only work if you have the externalities internalized throughout the whole economy, all the sectors that are affected by such an integration. Okay, secondly, we think that for the very long term, again, economically desirable framework, we need to think about supply-side efficiency. And that means that we should think about how to bring international removals into the system, So perfect that Danny already gave the introduction for this part. But in the very long run, we also should be open to the option to bring temporary removals into the system. I'm not saying that this needs to happen. Obviously, we don't really have a strong opinion if we need to have temporary removals in the system at all. We're pretty strict about what we want to start with. I think it's quite obvious that if you start some sort of compliance market integration process, you should start with those that are easier to monitor. But yeah, in the very long run, and if you think about supply side efficiency, we should at least be open to considering bringing temporary removals into the picture. The third category of conditions for the regulatory framework is the framework needs to be ready for overshoot management. We will probably or very, very likely miss the 1.5 degree mark this year, and it's pretty clear our mitigation efforts, they're not enough to fight climate change at the degree that we should. So at some point, governments need to realize that they have to be a buyer of removals at some point. And in Europe, we're already seeing this coming to reality. So the first member states have started their public procurement programs. The European Commission has recently started a process to gather information around this. And yeah, there has to be some sort of readiness for governments to step in and provide removals, at least to a certain degree. And what is related to that is that you also need to have an overshoot management strategy in place. And what we mean by that is you need to have clear targets and also the institutions in place to make sure that your strategy for overshoot management will materialize in the very long. So just to summarize, these are the conditions that we see that we want to work towards to. And now we basically model a world with full fungibility and see what would be the effects in the EU ETS 1 if this world would materialize basically from tomorrow onwards. And yeah, why do this? We want to look at the implications of such a direct and unconstrained integration, and we're mostly integrated in obviously the deployment effects and also the price effects we see for the certificates in the market. And we do that by integrating novel DAX cost data that you see on the right of the slide that have been developed by our colleague Katrin Sievert at the ETH, and we also bring BECS into the model. So these are the only two methods that we model in this work. And we combine this with the latest Fit for 55 revision of the European emissions trading system. And yeah, being aware that these cost estimates for DAX are quite dependent on its assumptions, we also test a few scenarios for global DAX deployment and see how different cost scenarios play out in the end. Let me start with this main result. So as you can see, first of all, we have here the emissions without a CDR integration, and here the emissions with the CDR integration. And in comparison, in the quantity, you can already see that not a lot of the residual emissions are actually affected by this. And I will go into the discussion of this in just a second. But just to say, as one main takeaway, because in the European debate, these things are often mixed, I think for many residual emissions, the question will not even be there if they're going to be replaced by removal, because it's just so much more cost effective to abate than to remove. But at the same time, you can see that with an integration, we managed to cut the allowance prices by almost half. So instead of landing in a scenario with more than 600 euros of an allowance price under the EU ETS with a removal integration under our assumptions, and I would highlight that it really depends on the assumptions that you make, we end up with 300 euros in 2050 instead. And I will discuss which kind of implication this also has for the political processes here in Europe in just a minute. So as I've said, we are aware that the results really hinge on our assumptions, and one of these factors are our DAX cost assumptions. We have modeled 3 scenarios where you see one deployment with low global DAX deployment, one scenario with high global DAX deployment, and obviously respectively, then here we see much higher DAX prices, here much lower DAX prices. And the results are quite striking. So in the scenario where the DAX costs remain high, the CO2 price in the system would be driven then by marginal abatement of industry and cost for bioenergy, and basically skyrocket still up to almost 500 euros. Whereas in a world where DAX gets cheaper than expected, we don't really see that much of an effect on the ETS price, but we see a doubling of the residual emissions that stay in the systems, stay in the system. And this is a first warning that, okay, even if the scales are not that high, as you can see in our base scenario, we have like 60 megatons of residual emissions per year in the system by 2050 and 2060. But even at this lower scale, obviously, the prices at which removals come into the system, they make the difference. So let me discuss the learnings from our results for a second. Our outcome not only depends on the DAX learning rates and the deployment, but as I've said already, it's really important which kind of marginal abatement cost for the existing EU ETS sectors we assume. And it's also important which kind of bioenergy cost we assume. These are the 3 drivers in our system or in the way we model an integration that drive the deployment and also the cost effects. And it really depends on what you assume for these three things. And what we identify from our modeling is basically 2 main risks. So as I already mentioned in the theoretical part of this work, there is the risk of having biomass excessively used in the system when the DAX cost expectations are not met and the cost for bioenergy remain low. We don't model the scenario yet. We're just working on it at the moment, and a later version of this paper will have the scenario as well. But it's quite obvious. I mean, if bioenergy remains cheaper and we can generate cheaper removals and we let the market decide, obviously we'll have a lot of bioenergy in the system and BECCS in the system as well. The second main risk is the risk of abatement deterrence, which has been discussed very extensively in the literature. So in our modeling, actually the primary risk is not as prevalent because we assume a fixed cap. And as I've already described, the cost-effective abatement will always crowd out the removal incentives in the system. Also, we don't assume for any reversal and any reversal risk. So in our system, CDR is reliable and permanent. And in the real world, obviously, this is not the case. But just to say, in our modeling, we don't see a primary risk of abatement deterrence. What we can already infer from our results, though, is that there's a serious secondary risk when both DAX and BECCS costs remain high. So if our DAX cost expectations do not materialize, and at the same time we run into a future in which bioenergy remains costly, then carbon prices will be much higher than anticipated, and in this world, especially with the right-wing parties on the rise, you could expect a political backlash from what we call the ETS endgame. So a lot of scarcity on the market and then carbon prices that the consumers are not happy to see. And this is something that we point out in the paper is one of the main risks, or it's actually the channel through which we think abatement deterrence might make or might bring a huge challenge into the system. And these risks, exacerbated by political instrumentalization through certain actors, they motivate a sequencing approach towards removal integration. So the conclusion that we take from our modeling is we cannot integrate, obviously cannot integrate removals in an unconstrained or direct way. We need a slow sequencing approach that allows for all of these risks. And I don't want to go into detail here, but what we envision is basically a 3-stage gate model in which you first have a stage with no integration at all. You make sure the MRV is in place and that you bring in removals into the system from which you know that they will not put the integrity at risk. And only if you can make this sure, this is what we highlight by gate A, and we can also go into the details of the gates a bit later in the future, but only if these conditions are met, you are allowed to move into the second stage, which we call gradual integration. And we envision this gradual integration to happen in 3 dimensions. So first of all, we increase the scope. So we start with existing plants first. We already have bioenergy plants in the system. And if you retrofit them with CCS, then it makes sense to start with the bioenergy that you already have, to not put any more stress onto the biosystem, stuff like that. And only when you have integrated the plants that are already there, you can start extending, bringing in ducts, and so on. The second dimension of integration that we foresee is quantity. Obviously, you will not allow the market to be swamped in the beginning. You start with restrictions. They could be direct quantity restrictions, or you have some price restrictions, exchange rate in place. And you make sure that whenever the integrity of the architecture is put at risk, you're still in control, and you bring in only the amount of removal certificates that allow an integration while keeping the integrity of the system in place. And the third dimension of this integration is time. And what we mean by that is, obviously, and this is a very old debate about climate policy and flexibilities, to increase the efficiencies in the system, we could envision a future in which you allow for some intertemporal flexibility. You guys in the US, you've really driven the debate around advanced market commitments. So it might have the form of something like that, where you buy removals today, but only if the delivery happens in the future. And then obviously you have to come up with safeguards against the risks that come with these kind of models, but at least you can bring forward a few of the deployment incentives already, and at the same time keeping the carbon market in check and shielding it from this risk, this political risk of extremely high carbon prices, which would basically make the system obsolete in the very long run, in any case. Happy to go into detail in the discussion a bit more. So let me finish with a few takeaways. I think the main approach of our work was to dissolve the dichotomy of the separated versus integrated carbon markets for emission allowances and removal units a bit. We really wanted to come into this problem, and a lot of people, even up until now, they perceive this discussion on integrating versus not integrating as an attack on the integrity of the architecture. And rightly so, people ask, okay, why is the Climate Institute now aligning their interests with the fossil lobby? Like, to put it a bit more bluntly. And the answer is we do not, but we do see that there's a risk of not integrating as well, and that is that in jurisdictions that rely on the carbon market as their main policy instruments, we are entering a phase now where scarcity of allowances might bring us into political situations where the system implodes in any case. So obviously there's some sort of codependency between these two markets, and we believe it's a bit too simplified to say they need to help each other, because there are many factors at play, as I've tried to highlight. But obviously, yes, the carbon price can help to ramp up removals, and removal certificates can help to basically keep these markets functioning and also have a healthy carbon pricing system in jurisdictions like the EU in the future. Secondly, a CDR integration can incentivize removals and cut carbon prices, but the risks motivate a sequencing approach with safeguards against a second best reality. So I really try to highlight that you cannot just start with an integration without thinking about the very long-term risks and the challenges that come with that. And we believe that some sort of safeguards and this kind of stage gate approach where really keep check of the conditions that have to be met before you enter the next stage might be the way forward with that. Any sequencing approach relies on the credibility to follow through with the stages. Obviously, this is about creating market incentives for firms to deploy removals, and this only works if you find the right balance between precaution and credibility. And I think we're going to have a lot of stuff to discuss in this nexus in any case. But yeah, this is basically the main challenge with this whole process. And in the European context, we have come forward with this proposal to set up a European Carbon Central Bank to oversee this kind of process, to start with the procurement already, to take care of the MRV, and also make sure that the integration happens in a controlled way that is not putting the integrity at risk. I'll stop here and happy to take questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Darius. I'm not sure if you can see the Q&A, but some questions have popped up for you. The final question there on the list is basically, what can we learn from past mistakes as you're thinking about the sequencing model?
Past mistakes, you mean the CCS?
Yeah, does that question resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can only speak for the European context so much, but here the debate is really also dominated by the fears and the failures of the CCS debate for the power sector, and rightly so. Obviously, it is in nobody's interest to perpetuate fossil infrastructure with the proposals that we're bringing forward. And I think you have to differentiate a bit, because our current view is that in many cases, abatement is still going to be cheaper than removals, especially in the next 20, 30 years. But as soon as removal costs have come down and we don't see any meaningful abatement, then yes, you would have to probably come in and mandate some sort of users for removals, or kind of have a political process or a decision about which actors you would allow to profit from CDR integrations, and which ones need to basically follow through with their transformation in the very long run. And this all comes basically down to this trade-off between efficiency and integrity, right? So you want to have the flexibility, you want to just have as much flexibility in the system to reap the efficiency gains from an integration, but you don't want to overdo it with flexibilities, because then exactly these failures that happened with CCS and coal, they will come back and haunt you. And I think this is the kind of the space in which we operate right now. Yeah.
I have some noise outside, so let me invite Ingrid or Danny to step in if they have questions.
Yeah, I have a question on fungibility, Darius, but I do before that, I guess my question is sort of following on this: what can we learn from the CCS journey in the 2010s, etc. Is because you highlighted yourself that the cost uncertainty around DACs and BECS is one of the assumptions that, of course, makes the various scenarios a bit or very uncertain. And do you think, I guess, looking at your model as well, because this is probably it's market participants who have to take a bet of developing storage capacity today for it to be used and incentivized in the future. And I guess my worry with on this type of argument for the ETS integration is that the cost uncertainty for novel technologies like this is still very uncertain, right? So do you think, my question is basically, do you think this will actually solve the demand certainty that will create sufficiently large scale capacity in time? That's basically, it's fine if it comes at some point. The question is, does it come in time for early market participants to invest in capacity for the future?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great question. I think some of the questions in the Q&A section already go into this direction as well. Yeah, it's easy to answer. I mean, what market participants can bet on at least is that if the system stays in place as it is, and we can't even be sure of that with the current political momentum in basically all of our countries, but if the system stays in place, we will see rising carbon prices. And then it's rather a question of timing than cost uncertainty, because it will come with time, but nobody can tell you when. But obviously we will need additional instruments, especially in the early phases. I mean, when we start bringing in removals in our modeling in 2030, and by then DAX is still far too expensive to be deployed in the system. And if you and that's also why our view is you should have an initial phase in which maybe the government already procures initial quantities of CDR, makes sure the MRV is in place, but also to cover these cost differences until you allow this meetup of the cost curves between abatement and removals. But obviously it will not be the only policy instrument in the mix that will take care of this ramp up in reality. I think that's
and obviously I'm going to touch a little bit upon my critiques of why ETS shouldn't necessarily be sort of the main deliverer of this, but maybe Danny, before you go and maybe have a question, I just wanted to, and perhaps it was a clarification that I didn't catch, but you mentioned, of course, exchange rates or fungibility between removals and emission reductions. And just for clarification, so one is what level was it 1-on-1 in your model? And then the second question is, do you see there's obviously quite a lot of literature that you shouldn't treat removals and emission reductions as fungible from a climate perspective. Maybe from a market perspective, from a climate perspective, that's not appropriate. So how do you see that mitigation happening in the work?
Yeah. So in our modeling, we only have BECCS and DACS, and we assume no reversal risks, right? Which is obviously quite a blunt assumption already. But in such a scenario, when you can really make sure that the emission stays in the ground for like millennia, then I think this critique of not allowing fungibility at all might bring us into a situation where the cost of achieving the climate goals and the cost of climate policy in general becomes so high that it's not going to be feasible for us as society to reach the goals at all. And this is kind of obviously in an ideal world, we don't want any removal at all, but we have my view is we have already past that point, and we're past that point. And now we need to think of with this new reality, how can we make sure that the ramp up happens? And in this reality, then it's again this trade-off between how much flexibility do I want to give into the system and how much integrity do I want to keep. But yeah, I mean, if I can make sure that a ton of CO2 is removed with, let's say, a direct air capture plan for like $300, and the chemical industry would have to pay, I don't know, $600 per ton to abate the same ton, then from a societal perspective, we can make that decision, yes. But then we need to be aware that the cost of achieving our climate policy goals are going to be substantially higher. And that's kind of the tricky tricky trade-off that we try to navigate here. Yeah.
Maybe just a quick question from my side, and I confess the longer I work on market design and standards, the less confidence I have in the ability of these approaches to deliver innovation. I mean, we are in an environment where $100 or €100 a ton is a high watermark for ambition. But I think when I look at higher quality CDR approaches, people hope for sort of $100, and that may be too low for several of the pathways we might have longer term confidence in. And I guess what worries me, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. I appreciate you've assumed you have stability. You've modeled, some strong and clear assumptions. I just get really nervous because I think you can start to claim $50 CDR if you start bending corners on the accounting, if you develop weak methodologies and protocols. And it seems to me in the current political space of where carbon prices are, including in the EU ETS, we're in an environment where those kinds of accounting weaknesses would be more politically salient. We're not talking about $600 a ton or €600 a ton. We're talking 50 to 100. This is the sort of range we've been in recently. Curious what you make of that at that price point, whether there's more of a risk of methodological deterioration and less of a prospect for true innovation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not as much an expert on the methodologies. We do have the carbon removal certification framework, just freshly out of the press. So here in Europe, I don't know what you think about that, Danny. And I think it's still the jury is still out on whether that would actually mitigate some of the concerns you have. But yeah, in the end, this is why we're saying this initial phase of having the methodologies in place and making sure that only reliable removals enter the system is very, very crucial. And we do not want to run into a situation where the economists used to call it dodgy certificates, and I think it's a good way to also explain what happened with the CDM. We don't want dodgy certificates to enter. So in terms of the price path, this is the beauty of the way the system is designed. We expect prices that are much higher than the current ones today, but obviously that doesn't mitigate this risk that people might try to evade the system with some funky reporting methods. And yeah, this is really where the devil's in the details after all, and our overarching study with the bold assumption doesn't really help to answer any of these questions. So grateful that you point out this additional risk. Yeah.
Thank you, Davis. There are additional questions for you in the Q&A, so feel free to respond in writing to those questions or hold them for conversation after Ingrid's presentation. Ingrid.
Thank you, Simon. So let me check. Does this work?
It does.
It does. Fantastic. Okay, so I will be touching upon a little bit more of the overarching concepts that I work on in Carbon Balance Initiative. Also work a lot with colleagues in Oxford around some of these topics, and hopefully it complements very much what Danny and Darius have been speaking about already. So one thing I want to highlight is I will highlight some research outputs or articles and work that we have done, but mostly it's about highlighting some questions and themes that I think is key to bring in to the CDR discussion around compliance markets as well as future policy mechanisms. I'll touch upon a little bit why we started Carbon Balance Initiative, what geological net zero is and its implications, some highlights around current mechanisms that are qualitative highlights, speaking with stakeholders in Europe and UK, and then finally I'll touch upon the mechanism that we talk about, which is mandatory carbon storage regulation or obligations. So a bit over 2 years ago, which I've just highlighted in the beginning, we founded Carbon Balance Initiative to basically drive the conversation or be the bridge between academic research and policymakers. We partner up with governments, UNFCCC bodies, ecosystem stakeholders, and academic partners to try to both input to research that needs to happen as well in an agile way, as well as, of course, disseminate a lot of the research that's already happening, already published, but that needs to come across the desk of a policymaker. And I just wanted to highlight our background because I think it's really, one is, of course, there's a deep collaboration need, but there is also a need for dynamic and responsive sort of agile research dissemination. And I know a lot of the researchers, both Danny and Darius, as well as others, spend a lot of time also trying to think about what does this mean for real world policy. But we spend a lot of time just communicating and working on those topics and thinking a lot about how to be evidence-based in our policy advocacy. And it's not a sort of shocker, but we keep focusing on geological net zero and a lot of fossil fuel accountability in the way we think about future policy. So I'll get onto the main topic. So exciting today I think it was 8 minutes ago, a paper was published by Allen and Co. and the original 2009 net zero papers and authors of those papers. And here's a sort of figure, and I'll tell a story about what is currently being misconstrued / something that's quite problematic in how we set targets and think about net zero currently. Both at the international level in the UNFCCC, but also down to national inventories and greenhouse gas accounting. So this is the original, I guess, net zero pathway and definition. You can see here that the net emissions that includes only anthropogenic or human-induced removals, not passive uptake due to past emissions, and unfortunately, in a lot of the IPCC or in a lot of the national greenhouse gas inventories, we are currently counting the managed land of passive uptake as a part of our net zero journey. And this is sort of shown by the shaded area here, that we would have to, if we keep doing this, we would have to go below, if we count passive uptake, we would have to go below 0 to actually halt warming aligned with the Paris Agreement. And potentially even way below or well below if we count all passive uptake, including ocean blue carbon. And I'm not an expert on Article 6, but going to some of the removal methodologies that will be created and designed there, this is an extremely important, I guess, scientific implication that we need to keep in mind when we talk about how we think, count, and define removals in the compliance markets. So for us, of course, aiming for net zero in this way, where you count all the passive uptake, you only stabilize concentrations. You actually don't limit warming to below 2 degrees. And it's ultimately, this, of course, allows to continued warming if we don't do human-induced removals. So I'll move a little bit forward with this is all within the rules of the national greenhouse gas inventories currently. This is also something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about geological net zero. And obviously, counting the way we do this, counting it currently, unless we redefine or reset the targets, undermines the goal of the Paris Agreement. And I just want to highlight this, which is in the paper that is published now 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago. The way we limit global warming is to reach a durable net zero, a stable state of temperature, and we need to reach geological net zero for the fossil-derived CO2 production that is remaining in the world economy or in the global economy by the time of net zero. And this is what we focus on. We focus on this blue circle of how can we ensure and embed the science behind this, the targets behind this, and ultimately ensure that the various accounting ways we can do, we need to keep to the track on the right goal. This is just a graphic to sort of show the balance that we're trying to reach, but I'll move on. So publish now, go and check it out. And ultimately, what I want to highlight is that we have written recently a brief that talks about how you could embed geological net zero pathways and targets in revised NDCs, in revised as well rules, for example, for Article 6, but also down to national policy mechanisms that we're going forward. And I just want to highlight these three recommendations that we make. We need to establish disaggregated separate accounting tracks for managed land, biogenic sinks, and geologically timescaled storage. We need to establish a geological removals target in both absolute and relative terms. And what we talk about here is a geologically stored fraction, tracking how much CO2 we're producing or emitting by continuing with fossil fuels or other industrial processes, as well as the storage we're doing in a progressive line towards net zero, and ultimately protecting natural things as a supplement and as a value in itself, not as a substitute and for reducing fossil CO2 and the net emissions there. So I will highlight that as those are the long-term goals that I am quite conscious that a lot of policymakers are not thinking of. They're not restricting the targets and methodologies accordingly, and it's worrying when it thinks about if the long-term goal is wrong, then how can we create mechanisms that gets us there? So I want to highlight some work, and it complements, especially what Darius just talked about, some of the conversations on ETS. So, of course, current support for CDR is mostly through voluntary carbon markets and government subsidies or support schemes. I just want to highlight some of the stakeholder conversations or qualitative research insights that we have seen in the last 2 years. So VCMs, it can have a catalytic effect for first movers, but it's unlikely to deliver scales, and it has issues of credibility, permanence, and greenwashing. And I want to highlight here Danny's comment on sort of the bottom-up approach, and I remember quite a few of the interviewees that we had a part of this one study called the VCM, a Wild West of methodologies. And then I want to highlight the government support element, which is very key for R&D and first-of-a-kind projects, which we're now seeing across Europe. But it does have the negativity of sort of picking losers and winners of who receives this funding, as well as something that we focus on a lot, which is the political uncertainty and instability of this in the future. So relying and thinking about governments being the main purchaser or the main supporter of individual projects is a very risky approach to take. So we often ask ourselves for how long, who, and what should we actually subsidize, and thinking about this as an active choice rather than something that a lot of market participants often do, which is ask for subsidies first and then think about long-term later. So we have worked a little bit, of course, on many markets. Participants hope for CDR and ETS integration. But what we've seen in our work is that this is sort of in itself highlights some problems or might not solve all problems. And I want to highlight that ETS has its function as a picking the most cost-effective abatement option. So it's very good for emission reduction, but might not be sufficient for CDR incentivization or scaling. And the first one is, of course, a very normal one. The short-term and medium-term ETS price levels are not high enough. They don't incentivize They don't incentivize large-scale investments or at least full value chain investments. And as I asked you, Darius, now one of the critiques there has also been then integrating CDR technologies into this would increase the cost uncertainty because there's cost uncertainty in itself with immature technologies. The second thing we've heard as a critique is sort of low investment confidence due to past trends or past actions, political decisions. So we saw this in the UK last year as well, where the ETS price dropped very quickly because of a political or minister decision, and you basically lose market confidence overnight, and this sort of affects the risk appetite of the obligated entities and other market actors that need to potentially invest in these technologies. The third one is the cost-effective abatement design of the ETS, which you highlighted yourself, Darius, as well. The ETS is designed to choose the most cost-effective or cost-efficient option, which is what it's designed to do, and it does well. But then how does that mean, or what does that mean for the most costly or more costly removals options, where we know that at least at a global level, but even at a European level, the potential removal scale is quite significant. So waiting for, I guess, this to be the only option might be risky for delivering all of the removals necessary. Which then you can complement with other mechanisms, but still a significant barrier. And then we have this, which is quite interesting with the workshop. This was mostly about storage in the UK, but there was a risk that was highlighted often about over-reliance on ETS could drive carbon price spikes in the long run. And this is mostly looking to sort of if there are supply lags for storage or CDR availability, then the demand is due to, of course, like increase with a declining ETS cap. The bottleneck of the supply could lead to quite significant price spikes, which of course is quite detrimental for those entities that needs to comply. And as Darius highlighted, this can be mitigated by integrating international credits or international removals, but it's still something that affects the market confidence in actors. And then the final two is quite something we hear again and again. And one is, of course, the uncertainty of what actual political designs will be chosen or selected. So we know some of the future ETS expansions, but do we know the detailed design for the CDR if it was going to be integrated? And similarly, there is, of course, a big concern in both the literature and wider ecosystem that we shouldn't treat emissions and removals as fungible, mostly because, of course, of the leakage risks, but also because of technological and resource constraints and potential delays in deployment. And sort of highlighting all of these issues, one of the things that we work on then is like, what alternative policies are there in the space? So how can we actually, if many believe it, this won't solve the problem, and some of these, or all of these highlights that I've done or risks is not my personal opinion. It's things we've heard from market participants. So how do we then create this stable, predictable, and sufficiently large demand to reach net zero and net negative capacity when it comes to removals? And in our opinion, this is sort of the missing piece, which is the obligations on mandating certain entities to do carbon storage or to do CDR, and something that I hope we can work on to figure out how can it complement existing structures like the ETS or other compliance markets instead of thinking only about the existing one currently. So we think a lot about this as how do we embed CDR in storage and entities regulatory license to operate conditions. This can both be as a market-based mechanism, but it can also be moving beyond and thinking a little bit more about only regulatory structures that an entity needs to comply to. And I want to highlight, which I've done previously in other talks as well, that these types of mandates are not new. You have them in other sectors. You have them with extended producer responsibility frameworks, where specific companies are obligated to make sure or deal with the waste after post-consumer stage. So this has been done in electronics and waste and plastics, etc. You have, of course, like mandatory performance standards for cars and vehicles, and you have low carbon fuel standards or even renewable energy obligations in the UK. You finally have something that we're quite excited about, which is Article 23 in Europe or in the EU now with the Net Zero Industry Act, which is obligating oil and gas producers in the EU jurisdiction to contribute to a storage target of 2030. This is mostly going to incentivize CCS in the short run, but thinking about learnings from structures like that to apply it to broader CDR frameworks is something that we work on and continuously try to think, how can we broaden this space and discussion? So why not a mandate for CDR on specific entities? And I'm going to finish up with some sort of prompts, because how can we actually design a compliance scheme that embeds so both predictable and stable, but also sufficiently large CDR demand whilst working alongside emission reduction schemes? And of course, fundamentally then thinking about how do we ensure that it keeps to the geological net zero target and applies the recommendations from the science down to the policy structure. So there are already some ideas out there. I can disclose that I work a lot on the carbon take-back obligation, which is an oil and gas obligation for CCS and CDR. There's the remove obligation. There's the carbon central bank idea alongside a ETS. There's this SB 308 style obligations on emitters that was proposed in California. And then there's more and more conversations happening around removal trading schemes and how you can create dedicated trading schemes around removal compliance. And I want to highlight one of our ideas, which is building on the carbon take-back obligation, but also about embedding cleanup in fossil fuel regulation. And going back to my prompt at the beginning around what do I think about often in this space, in addition to keeping the long-term target in mind, is who should pay. So hence we focus on cleanup in fossil fuel regulation. So because they have a higher ability to pay, because there's fundamentally a need to ensure like for like in the way you balance any residual or remaining fossil fuel CO2 production with a geological net zero goal. I think we need to move beyond the voluntary easy to change targets to mandatory transition plans, where you embed again cleanup and the transition and contribution to building this market that you need to have both for net zero but also for net negative. And then you have an historical and future producer responsibility to clean up their waste. And this is fundamentally quite important to keep in mind, because the reality is that fossil fuel demand is still very high and not compliant with the Paris Agreement, and licenses are being given out at record speed in certain countries. So how do we ensure that we keep a future producer responsibility for ensuring that we clean up the CO2 that they have been responsible for producing fundamentally? So that's some prompts from my side. I realize that there might be some questions, but I'll close the presentation, and then looking forward to discussing with Danny and Darius.
Thanks. We can go straight to that. Danny, Darius, questions?
I really appreciated it. I can't think of an immediate question other than to say I think we're all tripping around the same issues, which is how do you account for this and how do you pay for it? And I am struck, my impression from talking to people on the industry side, people are panicked about where the next tranche of money is going to come from. And I think existing ETS systems look like they have dollar signs on them, but wow, it sure is hard to do long-term offtake. Price instability in every program is insane. And I'll say this, I wrote a book about the political economy of compliance markets. I am a big fan of Europe's ETS program. I think the UK program being very similar, there's a lot to recommend them. They're global outliers. Nobody else has programs that operate at those price levels in market structures. And even those programs have experienced a fair degree of volatility. So I just keep coming back to how are we trying to get people to pay hundreds of dollars a ton for high quality things? It's not clear to me that any of these approaches is really well targeted at the early stage innovation problem we have right now. And that makes me nervous, both from the goal of trying to deploy and from the goal of trying to create, reasonable accounting methodologies so that we know what we're getting and we don't sort of misstate what we're getting, appreciating that some of what we're going to get in early stages is about learning rather than producing net climate outcomes. We are trying to squeeze everything through a carbon accounting box that is not ready to go from my perspective. And it's a really tough problem. It wasn't a question so much as I don't know what to do, and I really appreciate your input.
Can I comment on this, because this is one of the things we hear the most when we, of course, define the geological net zero as the gold star, and hence we need to work backwards, right? So there's a level of high permanence, and for more and more we're starting to talk about geological timescale storage as well, not to only think about just geological storage, but there's equivalence of time of storage. I think there is a level of, I'm at least I don't have the answer to this, Danny, but I'm extremely afraid of cutting corners now, spending 10 years trying on it, and then realizing it doesn't work and it has minimal effect, and the millions and millions or billions and billions of dollars that will be spent doing something that have very minimal climate impact. So there is a minimum standard that I think we need to figure out with market participants as well as, of course, with the academic and policy community, to ensure that what we actually do invest in makes a difference. Yeah.
Ingrid, I'd be curious to know, and this comes a bit back to your policy recommendations that you showed in the end, how you think about responsibility, and obviously this question, who's gonna pay at the end. Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer, but yeah, you've obviously thought a lot about this problem, so I'd be very curious to hear from you, because I mean, just saying the oil giants are gonna pay for it, yeah.
That's good and easy, but how do you regulate an industry
Exactly.
that's big?
Absolutely. I'd be happy for that, but yeah, I don't think it's gonna happen. So how do you think about also historical response? If you talk about overshoot management, then we also need to think about historical responsibility. So how do you think about this part of the challenge at the moment?
Yeah. So of course, I think, first of all, which is the easy answer in any social science, of course, everyone needs to pay a little, everyone needs to contribute, and there needs to be a structure where, as you said, there might be a government carbon central bank or a government procurement at a high level to some degree towards 2050 and beyond. I think relying on that and relying on government to pay is an extremely risky approach when we're talking. So you as an economist, Darius, you must have read as well more and more literature on sort of how do you create models for deep uncertainty, and how do you create models for this sort of I guess, like disorderly and deeper uncertainty outcomes in the future, which is not the planned pathways we've taken. And I think politics is, of course, one of the most deep uncertainty points out there, and we've seen that recently in an election. So I think moving to rely on governments to be one of the main purchasers of CDR, of the remaining CDR budget, the need for CDR is very risky, in my opinion. Then you talk about emitters and sort of hard industrial emitters, which is obviously the emitters pay or the polluters pay principle from the beginning, is thinking about those who emit at the end of the value chain. Those should also be responsible. I personally think this is my personal opinion, but one, it's a very, very difficult space to regulate. There's thousands and thousands of entities if you include all emitters. That's why the sort of upstream regulation is quite economically interesting, but also regulatory interesting, is because you target maybe 200 entities instead of 10,000 to comply with something, and they will embed the cost of the CDR and trickle it down in what is most economically efficient of spreading the cost across. Whereas currently we obviously target the sort of midpoint of a value chain. And one thing that I'm happy to hear or to hear your opinion on this, Darius, because one thing that we've been also quite worried about is expecting that the very last residual industrial emitters in, for example, the ETS, but now recognizing Danning's point that not all jurisdictions have a sophisticated ETS, but working with only those hard to abate residual emissions that might be so and so many entities, I'm skeptical that they will have the profit margins to be able to pay for the CDR capacity that we need at that point. So we need to build up mechanisms where people or entities or producers that we prefer today contribute to the capacity needed for the future. Because if you rely on only the last bit of entities that have not managed to abate all of their emissions or not managed to reduce and shift to greener technologies, then it's a very small, hopefully a very small pool of companies and countries maybe. So that was my answer, long drafted answer to a very difficult question. But we hope and we work with talking to every type of stakeholder around the oil and gas type regulations. And we also talk to oil and gas companies about this. They're not a fan, surprise, but I think every big type of fossil fuel producer is understanding that the space is changing and that they need to be changed. They need to change with it. And the question is then, how do you level the playing field so everyone is regulated instead of only relying on first mover companies?
Yeah, I completely agree, Ingrid. I think it's exactly the discussion that we observe here as well, engaging both policymakers and with industry. I mean, polluter pays principle, it works up until a certain amount. And actually, I mean, okay, on the voluntary carbon market, you have these tech companies who just, just for fun, basically buy these large amounts, relatively large amounts. But there is industrial emitters in Europe who would be interested in buying certificates, even at a premium, if it gives them some sort of regulatory value, So
Yeah.
I think to a certain degree, is this feasible? Definitely. But I'm completely with you. I'm not sure it's realistic to put a whole burden of overshoot management finance onto 200 or 300 firms in a given jurisdiction, because that might simply drive them out of business.
And without talking about specific policy, I think that's why we need to talk about sort of the stored fraction idea of thinking about, we know we need to be at the absolute as well as the relative targets around 2050 in various countries around the world. How do we build up capacity towards that aligned, and in our preference that is through mandatory regulations. So you need to scale up this for a set level of entities. If you decide emitters instead of producers, that's a political decision ultimately, or maybe even an economical one. but having this sort of trajectory is fundamentally needed, and of course that's what all target setting is about. But I am sometimes worried about target setting being these absolute sort of just a quantity targets instead of talking about fraction targets where we measure against which pathway we're on, not which pathway we dreamt we were on. Yeah. Simon, over to you.
I don't even know what pathway we're on. I mean, we've got an hour and a half and people have just kind of waved their hands at the US election result, but I feel like I need to bring it into the room, in part because we have the US-European mix on the call. And so let's just kind of play the comparative game a little bit. Danny, you're sitting in California. Maybe you can draw on the Californian experience a little bit just to talk about what you're seeing, what we can learn from it. One thing I'm struck by in the conversation, and you're referencing the fact that the ETS system is so unusual when we look at the global situation. I can sit here in the United States, American universities in Washington, D.C. I can imagine potentially a market-based conversation around carbon removals moving forward now. But mandates, holy cow, feel like they're just completely off the table, particularly if they would be imposed on oil companies. So, Danny, as you think about where you're going to spend your time, is the political calculation top of mind, or what else is resonating for you?
I mean, here in California, we ask the oil companies how they want to be regulated. That's more or less how it works, especially when it comes to our market-based policies, which are designed not to do a whole lot. Hopefully that'll change, but we have really struggled despite talking a talk that suggests we're equals of the European experience on carbon pricing. We've never come close, and we've intentionally managed our program not to do what the European program has done. One of the things I find really striking is there's an equal push right now in California to say we've got to let carbon removal into the carbon market, which trades $30, $35 a ton right now, which is, thank you for smiling and a little chuckle. It's not relevant, but the political forces in labor and in the oil industry are so gung-ho on saying there's an infinite scale, because the Department of Energy has been saying there's an infinite scale. We'll just build, build, build. That there's this remarkable pressure to talk about scaling, especially geologic removals, with very weak price signals that don't seem to bear any relationship to reality. So I'm really struck, again, as somebody who is a cautious proponent of deploying some of this work and figuring out how to do it. I think we're at too inchoate and early of a scale to quantify and turn into markets what is right now an innovation problem. And I'm not fundamentally opposed in theory in all contexts to doing it through markets in the long run, but we are really early stage. And I worry that we're talking tons when we really need to be talking dollars and euros and all sorts of other currencies. And I just worry that this sort of pressure to say we're doing something different is going to lead to things that don't really address the innovation gap we're seeing right now. So California is a weird space to be in for all of this, because we basically declare ourselves different from the federal government, especially in bad times like these. But it's not entirely clear to me that our strategy for being different is actually matching the moment in any serious way, especially when it comes to removal, where unfortunately California has bought into this notion that you could do like 25% of your emissions you could mitigate through removals was an initial discussion point. And it's down to 15%, but there's really no serious appetite for turning the screws and in either encouraging early stage innovation or mandating the kinds of outcomes that would generate those outcomes. Because, just to be really blunt about it, it's not really clear who wants to pay for carbon removal, especially when we're not on track for mitigation, which, even in a place like California, we are shockingly not on track for our near-term mitigation goals. And I think that is maybe the elephant in the room here, that will continue to fracture the coalition in support of carbon removal. If we're not on track for emission reductions, what's the point?
And Ingrid, as you weigh in, let me just tie in one of the questions there from the Q&A. So the question was, why rely on government to maintain mandates or to maintain requirements on companies, for instance, rather than procurement, right? If we can't rely on government for one, why should we trust that the government will do the other?
Okay, can I answer that second? Because I have a comment to Danny, which is I think there's one thing that I highlight from a paper we had earlier this year with myself and some colleagues was exactly that the lack of inherent demand for removals is the fundamental specific issue that we don't seem to overcome currently. And this is uniformly, everyone highlights this as one of the top 3 barriers to deployment or to investment. So absolutely agreed that one is very clear. I think when you don't have then it seems, but I think this group has moved beyond VCM. We don't think that will be the scaler. It might be the innovator, but it's not the scaler. So of course, then you come to compliance-based. And one thing I'm going to highlight there is learning from the CCS space in UK back in 2010s, and something that we seem to be talking about again in the CCS space in the UK, which I am fundamentally so frustrated by, which is that by basically only focusing on short-term policy and short-term subsidies or short-term projects, you and not having the medium to long-term certainty for where something is going and where the demand is coming from, you increase the capital of the projects, the short-term projects. So by having long-term and medium-term certainty, you reduce the cost of capital for short-term deployment, and innovation might come quicker. And I think this is something that is happening in UK again around CCS. This is not CDR, but of course, to some degree, the UK space has also done subsidies for some CDR work. But one of the things that is happening is that market participants keep pushing the sort of pre-2030 commitments. Whereas what we really need to, and that just like investors, insurance companies, there's so much uncertainty about what happened post 2030 that we're not even able to sign contracts or FIDs for 2020s. And I think this is something that I want to highlight, because when it comes to the US then, Danny, is what will happen post 2032 when the IRA 45Q credits and the carbon safe program is shut down. Right. So, and I know that there are market participants in the US at a federal level who is thinking about this. And the continuous question is, will government continue to support it? Will Trump completely scrap the whole thing? That's not what I'm hearing, but maybe that will happen. And I think that's where we sort of, moving into your question, Simon, how can we rely on government mandates and not government procurement to the same extent? Money is different than regulation. And when I think this is like government procurement, as they sit with a budget, a restricted budget of the future, where you will see most countries or nations have a lower growth level and a tighter government budget and an elderly population and public, I guess, institutions that are in need of money, which is increasing in the next decades. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago with the government's sort of ability to support. And if you then think 10 to 20 years from now, and the government needs to procure with the sort of financial procurement, which it needs to pay to buy the capacity, that is something they need to justify on their government books. And I think that's a much, much more politically uncertain decision to be made for new political government coming in for every 4 to 5 years, moving to 2050, than it is to keep a regulation in place that levels the playing field and ensures a direction and a sort of move of money in the private sector instead of a move of money in the government sector. So that would be my answer, Simon. I hope that was detailed enough, but I think I recently read the perspective brief of Norway in the 2060s, where I'm from, Norway, and it's the amount of problems that the socially democratic strong state of Norway is facing in the 2060s is so vast that CDR and climate is going to be down prioritized in many of these solutions, or I guess problems. So you need to create resilient structures that is not dependent on government money, because they will be choosing between healthcare or removals. Yeah. That was a bit of a pitch. I don't know about my political opinion.
Just a time check. So we have another 15 minutes for the session, then a 15-minute break before the keynote. So top of the hour for our session, and then 15 after the hour for the keynote. Darius, can I bring you back in? I'm struck by Danny's. Danny also made a pitch for us thinking about innovation. It strikes me that stage gates might get in the way of innovation. Another view from the US system, we do have a Wild West Ingrid, as you kind of put it, when it comes to voluntary market ambition and so forth around the growth of carbon removal. But what we're also seeing here is some investment in new ideas and a startup ecosystem that is pushing at least technical innovation forward. So there is, if we push for market certainty, I mean, you talked about this efficiency versus integrity trade-off. If we're pushing too much for certainty on the front end, could it be that we just never get there with the kind of carbon removal that needs to be established?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Danny already asked the question in this direction. I'm with you, Ingrid, pretty much. I mean, I think the VCM is a very powerful tool for innovation itself, but it will not bring down the cost as much as it is needed, because it will not be the scaler in the very long run. And I think that is the challenge that we're kind of facing, and that's where this kind of idea of an integration into compliance markets also originated from our end as part of the ETS community here in the EU. But obviously the criticism remains, and it's very valid. So for these first initial big price jumps, and integration alone will not be sufficient, especially in the years where it's needed, because for the time being we don't expect the ETS prices to reach several hundreds of euros, and that will be the prices that especially for the geological storage types of removals we will need to see. So yeah. Definitely a valid criticism, and yeah, as Danny has rightly said, we need to come up with solutions for this conundrum. Definitely.
Can I play a hopeful when I'm quoting my colleague Inge Johnston here? So it's not my thought. But when the election results was announced, and she did her PhD on looking at voluntary commitments and movements happening around the first Trump presidency. And this is, I guess, the hopeful. I'm playing the devil's advocate here, although I've already stated my thinking. There might be that when the market participant sees the government failing to move quickly on climate commitments and moving in the space of removals as well, there is, of course, a hope that you will have a coalition or a first coalition of movers and a coalition of movers for credible removals that sort of similarly to the net zero pledges happened around 2016. It was a spurge of sort of bottom-up voluntary commitments, and to that you obviously have now already seen a spurge of carbon removal projects. But if I'm going to play my own devil's advocate, perhaps this is what's going to happen in a politically and government difficult world in the next 10 years, that innovation and cost reduction will happen in that space because it's the only pillar left almost in the sort of political short term. But I'm still on Darius' answer. I'm leaning towards that wing, but yeah, over to you, Danny.
I'll just say, as I move to Danny, I just really appreciate you reaching for hope in the possibility of enormous government failing. So Danny, respond to that question, and then let me queue up another one for you. Just what is going to occupy you for the next 6 months? I'd love, just as we start to wrap this up, just to think about what's top of mind for you.
I think in this area, I think for me at least, the most optimistic direction is voluntary buyers clubs, and I'd offer maybe a friendly disagreement, Simon, with the way you phrased it earlier, with lots of private sector investment supporting innovation. I think a small number of venture capital firms spent a lot of money over the last several years, and everybody read the same McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group reports that said the voluntary carbon market would be at 50 billion a year, just right around the corner. So everybody said this is going to scale, this is the new thing, and they all dumped money based on the same market strategy, which has failed and will not work. But that doesn't mean that there won't be useful outcomes from this process if the small number of voluntary buyers who care a great deal about quality outcomes, and I do think there are several in the voluntary market, organize around saying, where do we need to be in 5 years? So similar to Ingrid's point, I think there's an opportunity to organize in this moment in time around getting ready to demonstrate what success looks like in different pathways, and to prepare for scaling efforts that are going to have to access public funds either directly or through mandates. And I think all of them have challenges around creating certainty in unstable political environments, of which the United States is now at the top of the list. So it's not an easy path, but I do think to me, the optimistic outlook would be to find a group of buyers who are prepared to commit to quality, rather than sort of delegating to the incumbent processes that produce junk credit quality standards, and could easily do that for all of the major carbon removal pathway applications. It is very easy to cut corners and create, bogus credits if you want to do that. And I worry that the market pressures are going to say keep costs as low as possible, and we'll end up in that direction. I will say, as somebody who's again takes carbon removal very seriously, I'm a strong proponent of doing it right. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. I don't think carbon removal is going to be the top of my priority list for the next 6 months in climate, and I don't say that to the detriment of those who will focus on it. There will be places where there are meaningful opportunities to engage, but I am reminded that, particularly in places that are struggling to decarbonize, that have the economic capacity and, in theory, the political will to do it, but are having, difficult politics. The US is, maybe the most pressing example of this. I can't say that it's at the top of my priority list, and I can't say it in California, which is farther ahead than the federal government in some respects, because we're still far behind on our emission reduction goals. And I think that continues to be the most important thing, without disrespecting or denigrating the important role carbon removal has to play in the balancing, and as an overall framing about what any residual emissions need to be managed properly through carbon removal. And that's a helpful way to frame the scale and integrity of the efforts we need going forward. But it's a tough time ahead. And I think the people who succeed are going to be the ones who are able to demonstrate in a few years, not because some certification process has put a sticker or a stamp on a particular methodology, but that they could actually say, check out our deployments here. We've had people look at them. They're wide open. You can see what we did. And, if you put more money in the till, you could do it at larger scale, and we're ready to show you how to do that. That's what a successful path in the next couple of years, I think, will look like.
Darius, can I give it to you?
Yeah, so I think coming from this ETS community and like this strong policy instrument in the center of the climate policy architecture in Europe, we have focused on the ETS mostly, or let's say the proposals that are related to the ETS, they are the most sophisticated ones in Europe at the moment, just because you don't need as much imagination to to come up with something, because there's already a lot there. So what I expect for the coming months is actually for especially us in research to expand the portfolio quite a bit, look at other options to especially bridge this innovation gap in the beginning, until integration can happen, and really think about how, say, governments can really efficiently procure reliable CDR, and make sure costs come down. So that's the first thing for the coming months. The other thing is, I agree with Danny. Also in our political ecosystem, CDR will not be a top political priority in the coming years. So what I would hope for is that it might be reintroduced through I don't know, maybe as an industrial policy measure or something, under disguise, basically a new disguise, and yeah, basically being reintroduced in the debates because of the industrial opportunities that would also come with that. Let's hope that for both climate tech and decarbonization of our big emitters and CDR, this will be the case, because otherwise it's gonna be a tricky way forward.
Started us off, Ingrid, by talking about things that keep you awake at night when it comes to carbon removal. Will you sleep easier after this panel?
Oh yes, we've solved it all, Simon. No. Yeah. We all just have questions that keep popping up whilst we talk. I think what will I will keep talking about the importance of getting net zero right in the very top level of conversations and commitments that individual governments do. I applaud you, Danny, for working in the Article 6 world. I think it's a beast and a complexity that I don't really touch that much. What we're hoping to focus on more is individual government conversation around their NDCs and low emissions strategy or strategies, and trying to really embed the fact that emissions must come down regularly, as we all know, and as is the top priority, as well as we need to create a scale up of the storage. And I think that sort of dual, I guess, like down and up crossing and fraction targets is something that I will keep talking about in both high level conversations of government commitments, but also down to policy specific implications, and hopefully but across Europe, that becomes prevalent in the next couple of years when we see where we're at with our emission reduction targets for 2030. One thing I will highlight, which we didn't touch upon that much, and I think it's because our panel is based in the US and Europe, but I will also keep an eye on what's happening in other jurisdictions around the world around these topics. There's, of course, many other conversations and policy mechanisms being developed in India, in African countries, in Asian countries, which I think we also should keep an eye on when we think about the larger picture on global net zero. So I will do both of them, hopefully, Simon. Over to you. Thank you so much for having us.
Really grateful, Ingrid, Danny, Darius, for joining us for this 4th annual Law and Policy Conference on Carbon Removal from the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. We're going to move to a 15-minute break. I see that Erin Burns is ready to go from Executive Director from Carbon 180. So she will start her talk at 15 after the hour. Feel free to stay in the room if you would like to until that time. Thank you all again for a great panel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.